Lawrence M. Principe is the Dew Professor of the Humanities at Johns Hopkins University in the Department of History of Science and Technology, and he's also a professor in the Department of Chemistry. He is also the director of the Singleton Center for the Study of Pre-Modern Europe. Professor Principe is the first recipient in 2005 of the Francis Bacon Medal for significant contributions to the history of science. This is an award presented only to an outstanding scholar whose work has had substantial impact in the history of science, the history of technology, or historically engaged philosophy of science. He earned undergraduate degrees at the University of Delaware, BA in liberal arts and a BS in chemistry, and did his graduate work at Indiana University, receiving a PhD in organic chemistry. And then at Johns Hopkins University, after he had finished that PhD and begun his academic career, he worked for and received another PhD in the history of science from Johns Hopkins. His main research interests focus on alchemy, chemistry, during the 16th to 18th centuries and the interactions of science and religion. We're very pleased to welcome and to listen to Professor Lawrence Principe as he deals with the topic Scientism and the Religion of Science. Professor Principe.
Well, thank you very much for the kind introduction, and thank you all for your presence here. I'm very happy to be here, and I hope we can have an interesting time and discussion this afternoon. I suppose I should begin best by saying that my talk this afternoon will probably be somewhat different from the previous contributions to this series, because I noticed that the earlier speakers have come predominantly from philosophical backgrounds, while I, on the other hand, am chiefly a historian and a chemist. So my approach to the topic of scientism is a predominantly historical one, depending largely on observations and analyses of both distantly and recently past events, rather than upon rigorously philosophical analyses. Well, I realize immediately that this approach might be thought to rule out any relevance I might have for those who have adopted a rigorously scientific outlook, since the musings of historians might be thought unable to live up to the standards of scientism. Yet, all scientific studies and conclusions must, by necessity, involve historical events, those things we call observations that occur in time and place, and that must of necessity precede in time any deductions or inductions that we draw from them. The alternative would be to have science exist in a temporally infinitesimal present, or the timeless neverwhere of pure mathematics. And scientific observations made in time and place by human agents are subject to interpretation and possible distortions, no less than the observations that are made by mere historians. But, oh dear, you'll see that I have slipped into philosophizing now, and so I'll begin again. Within the cozy surroundings of the historical, I'll try to address three main questions. First, what is scientism? I'm sure my predecessors here have expressed that in their own way, but we need to make sure we're talking about the same thing at the start. Second, where has scientism come from? What are its origins and its ingredients? And this, of course, is a thoroughly historical question, and so I'll spend most of my time on that one. And then finally, I'd like to explore scientism's consequences. How does it affect current thought and culture? And what roles does it play in modern culture? And what directions does it give to human thinking? We can dispatch the first question rather quickly. Although there is, of course, a certain range of definitions for scientism, there also exists a fairly consistent core of features that I think can be agreed upon by both its advocates and its opponents. Most central is the belief that science and its methods provide the only valid route to gaining knowledge for answering questions, to the exclusion of other methods and disciplines. Of course, this definition is really satisfactory only if we define, in turn, what those methods actually are. Since the very term science and what counts as the so-called scientific method, which I'm actually yet to see put into practice, but that's just an aside, what counts as scientific method have varied considerably across time and cultures. What is customarily meant by science, by those to whom the term scientism applies, is current day, empirical, natural sciences, and its method is that of observation, possibly including direct or instrumental measurements, very often with some level of mathematization, together with the method of induction. I would hope that no one would take issue with the notion that current-day natural science should and must pursue its questions and endeavors by means of particular agreed-upon methods that we choose to call scientific. And in fact, the methods of modern science have proved enormously successful in answering a myriad of questions about the natural world. The difficulty or the contention arises only when the exclusionary claim is made that only science as we understand it and pursue it today is capable of providing valid and acceptable answers to all questions, and that any questions it cannot answer are either meaningless or simply not worth asking. It is the hegemonic, universalizing, and exclusionary claims of what one might call strong scientism that lie at the crux of the argument. And it's these claims that render scientism something worthy for us to discuss here. But of course, it's not merely the holding of scientific beliefs that generates controversy. If these ideas were privately held and used to guide an individual's work and behavior, there might be interesting discussions occasionally over coffee in academic environments, but probably not a great deal more. But for scientism's vocal advocates, a key feature of the system is, well, depending on whether you prefer the religious or the political metaphor, imperialism or evangelization. This situation arises naturally from the uncompromising claims of strong scientism. It claims to be the only acceptable system for gaining knowledge, for deciding disagreements, and anything else is a poor second or simply a delusion. Thus it is that scientism comes to our notice in particular when it is used against religion. It could equally, I should point out, be turned against the insights that are offered and expressed by poetry, by art, by music, by aesthetics, and in which case its advocates might simply be labeled as Philistines and ignored. In that case, I think I probably wouldn't have been invited to speak here this evening, and you might not have turned out to see me. You still might regret the later decision, but we'll wait and see. But when it is put in opposition to the institution that has, more than any other, made use of and fostered poetry, art, music, and aesthetics, namely religion, and its claims and religion's claims to have something significant to say about the human condition and human beings' place in the universe, and something which most of the globe considers to offer a particular and valuable vision of the truth, there the conflicts begin. And this being the case, my thoughts to this afternoon turn especially towards the interaction of science, scientism, and religion. Well, I think it's probably safe to say we have all heard something or other about the conflict between science and religion. But this shorthand expression is far too broad and imprecise. No serious historians of science today acquiesce in the simplistic notion of a conflict or warfare between science and religion. Their real interaction has been complex and varied over time. We can begin to amend the broad claim of a conflict between science and religion by proposing it is really a conflict between scientism and religion. And let's see how this hypothesis fares against the historical data. The claim for science to have a special or indeed exclusive access to truth, and the idea of a more or less constant state of conflict between science and religion arise from the same set of historical sources and contingencies. First on the list is the legacy of Comtean positivism, a formulation deriving from the ideas of the early 19th century philosopher Auguste Comte. In the 1820s, Comte began searching for ways to reground society in the aftermath of the French Revolution and Napoleon's rise and fall. In the 1840s, he posited his law of three stages for human societies, namely that they progress through three successive phases of development. First, the theological, then the metaphysical or philosophical, and finally the positive or scientific. And looking around at his contemporaneous France, here's where the contingency comes in, he viewed the 18th century revolution as the end of the first phase, the attempts of Napoleon to reconstitute law and society on a secular basis as the second, and his current day of the mid-19th century as the dawn of the scientific or positive phase, when science and scientific principles, free from uncertainty and ambiguity, would provide a rational basis for the reformulation of human society according to a new science he labeled sociology. Comte's positivism thus implied that religion belonged to a primitive state and science to a mature state of humanity. His law of three stages was soon thereafter both popularized and interwoven with the notion of perpetual struggle between science and religion by John William Draper's 1874 book, The History of the Conflict Between Religion and Science. Draper, a chemist by profession, actually the first president of the American Chemical Society, I rather say that to my own chagrin as a chemist, and an amateur historian, was commissioned to write this work as part of a series devoted to the popularization of science. Surprisingly, it became a bestseller. It passed through numerous editions and translations and remains easily available today. Now, if any of you out there should wonder how much influence a book well over a century old, and a book that you probably have never read and might never have heard of, how much influence it might still possibly have, let me do a little test now. I do this with my students when I'm teaching my classes, and so I'm eager to try this out on a new demographic. Okay? So, how many of you were taught at some point in your schooling that in the Middle Ages, or more precisely before the time of Columbus, people thought the world was flat? Okay, that's pretty unanimous. How many of you were taught that, for example, the Catholic Church forbade and or punished human dissection? Okay, both of those things are lies, or at best, very, very sloppy historical claims. And both of them were disseminated predominantly by this book, along with countless other falsehoods about the history of science and the history of religion. It is astonishing the influence that this book has had. Well, today, Draper's book must be considered a historical artifact, not a source. Let's contextualize it historically. Even a quick glance reveals it as a specifically anti-Catholic rant that often reaches the level of the hysterical. In fact, I think if more people read the book, they would become so disgusted with it that they would reject the things that we've all heard that have come down from that book uncritically. I try to get some kind of readings out of it for my students, but every time I try to do it, they're just so absurd and so melodramatic that I knew my students would just laugh at them, so I tend not to give them out. Draper's hatred of Catholics is part and parcel of late 19th century American racism, founded on the deep roots of English racism, particularly against newly arriving Irish Catholic immigrants. But it also stems from a very personal fury, as the son of an English Methodist minister, at his sister's private conversion to Catholicism. So vehement is his hatred that he refers to the rise of Islam as the Southern Reformation, a precursor to the Northern Reformation of Luther, and he contrasts Islam, which he supposes is ever beneficial to science, with Catholicism that is ever opposed to it. In fact, interestingly, when I was writing this, I did a little search on the internet, and I actually found a couple of sites that are run by basically crusading Muslims that are using Draper's book against Christianity. Very interesting how books have their own fate, don't they? Well, Draper is also mightily perturbed by two statements made by the First Vatican Council in 1870. The first declaration was against materialism, the idea that matter is all that exists. The second is against the claim that scientific inquiry and unaided human reason can reveal everything there is to know. In other words, the First Vatican Council in 1870 gave a refutation of what we now call scientism. Draper is perturbed because such a statement opposes his beloved law of development that he got from Comte, and perhaps more viscerally, because it places limits on scientists' authority to speak on all matters whatsoever. And this issue of authority is a crucial point to which I will return in a few moments. The second book of note is that of Andrew Dickson White, the founding president of Cornell University. He began speaking of battles between science and religion as early as 1869, and this culminated in his massive 2-volume History of the Warfare of Science with Theology in Christendom that he published in 1896. Well, White's work is different from Draper's in several respects. It proved less popular, it was certainly less hysterical, and it was more extensively footnoted. His tone is rather more placid. He argues that religion is good in itself, but it should steer clear of science, for their interaction damages both. Nevertheless, it's no more reliable as a historical source. And it too emerges from a very contingent, very personal context. White's book is a response to criticism he received over the founding of Cornell University as a secular institution, in contrast to virtually all other colleges and universities in the United States at that point, all of which, very nearly all of which had religious affiliations. And the book's attempt is therefore to answer the kind of criticism he had personally received. I have to emphasize again that no historians of science today consider either Draper or White's depiction to have any historical credibility. Really, their fundamental error is their assumption of the existence of two groups, religionists and scientists, that simply did not exist before the late 19th century. Because virtually every contributor to scientific knowledge in Europe before the 19th century was also a believing Christian, many very deeply religious, and many of them clergy. The great majority saw the exploration of the natural world as a kind of religious devotion. In this, they based themselves on the well-known doctrine of the two books, enunciated by St. Augustine of Hippo in the 5th century. The African doctor argued that God reveals himself to humanity in two qualitatively different fashions. One, by inspiring human beings to pen the book of Scripture, and two, by the act of creating the universe, which Augustine called the book of nature. If we can learn to read the book of nature by studying it, we thereby learn ever more about its creator. Now, I'd love to go into this in greater detail, but Augustine makes a very interesting and very surprising claim. He says that studying and interpreting, he says both books require study and interpretation, but studying the book of nature is actually easier than studying and interpreting the book of Scripture. As a result, this means for him that when we learn something by studying the book of nature, it has to be harmonized with our interpretations of the book of Scripture, because it's actually easier to get the right meaning out of nature than it is out of Scripture, which is a kind of remarkable statement if you think about that for a little while. Well, how about some more historical examples? Robert Boyle, the champion of chemistry and the discoverer of the fundamental gas law that bears his name, was called in his eulogy a lay bishop, and his publications divide evenly between theological and scientific topics. In fact, he argued in one of his publications that doing scientific experiments was a particularly good thing to do on Sundays because it was a kind of worship. Isaac Newton devoted at least as much time to theology and biblical studies as he did to mathematics or physics. And it's trivially easy to cite a long list of scientific achievements from the Middle Ages to the present brought forth by ordained priests. St. Albert the Great's 13th century work on mineralogy and embryology, Pierre Gassendi's 17th century revival of atomism, the Jesuit Athanasius Kircher, one of my personal favorites, and his descent into the crater of an erupting Vesuvius in 1636 to make observations about volcanism. Niels Steno, a convert to Catholicism and now, interestingly enough, a Beatus, who set the foundations of modern geology in the 1660s by observing fossils and strata. John Ray's late 17th century botanical classification system, and we can come to the mid-20th century with the father of Big Bang cosmology, Georges Lemaitre, a Belgian Catholic priest who held degrees in the sciences from Cambridge, Harvard, and MIT. Well, so much for the dogma of strong scientism that asserts that Christian belief disables one from scientific research and achievement. To say a few words about perhaps the most famous historical case, the supporters and detractors of Galileo were evenly distributed among ecclesiastics and laymen, and both criticism and support of Galileo's system of the Earth's motion came from both theology and current-day scientific knowledge. While some churchmen and secular professors did in fact criticize him, the Jesuits at Rome gave him a celebratory feast in honor of his discoveries. And his friend, the Cardinal Baronio, quipped to his critics that, quote, "The Bible tells us how to go to heaven, not how the heavens go." So, into which of Draper and White's camps should all these figures be assigned? Are they religionists? Are they scientists? Obviously, they're both and neither. The point is that Draper and White were illegitimately transporting the emerging social stratifications of their own era backwards into earlier times. By constructing the notion that two rival camps had existed throughout history, they set up an inherent and essential rivalry between science and religion that never existed as such. Interestingly, despite their explicit use of a military metaphor, they implicitly, whether consciously or unconsciously, borrowed the imagery and structure that characterized the history of religion. They created a litany of martyrs, most notably Bruno, Galileo, but also Roger Bacon, Michael Servetus, and others, and a hagiography of sinless and oppressed reformers, visionaries, and prophets that populated the scientists' camp. In other words, they recast scientists as priests, the recipients of special favor and enlightenment, who brought forth truth and struggled to spread a new gospel of science and progress against the darkness and ignorance of the pagans, that is, the old priesthood of religion. In short, this origin myth, for that is what it is, of science laid the foundations for setting up science as a religion of its own. Well, this origin myth of science remains extraordinarily powerful today and stands at the core, I think, of scientism. Indeed, it's been my personal experience that it's rather dangerous to question its orthodoxy around those of a scientific persuasion. Let me tell you a few anecdotes. Some of you may know that I did a course on the history of science in video format. I once got a message from a distraught college student at a well-known and distinguished Californian university who told me that I had destroyed his image of the world and faith in science because all these heroes that he had been taught to look up to in the sciences, well, he discovered they were religious. Well, what I wrote to him is I said, well, life is full of surprises, isn't it? Well, while I routinely critique the claims of both religionists and scientists in my books and lectures, I only occasionally hear anything negative from the religious side. On the other hand, when I present well-established historical evidence that undercuts the simplistic scientific version of, let's say, Galileo and the Church narratives, or describe the scientific and logical features of medieval theology, or, God forbid, point out the inaccuracy of historical claims made by scientific prophets like Carl Sagan, then out come the firebrands and pitchforks. Now, curiously, I don't know quite how to explain this, and I leave it to you to mull over. Unlike those on the religious side that do write to me, the others never write to me directly. Instead, they post declarations of my heresy on websites, blogs, and as negative feedback on sites where my books and lectures are advertised, somehow as if making a public reaffirmation was more important than anything else. It's an interesting thing. Two things are very clear. First, any positive statements about historical figures in the religion camp are unacceptable. And second, these critics really, often by their own admission, have no historical training of their own, but instead rely entirely, perhaps I should say religiously, on the origin myth I mentioned above, and simply will not accept any evidence to the contrary, responding to such evidence with a simple, "No, I don't believe that," and a restatement of the dogmas of the origin myth. This is one reason why I must conclude that the strong scientism of the modern day is not just a religion, but is in fact a kind of fundamentalism. More on that point in a moment. The story that began with Draper and White fits very neatly into a literary trope beloved of the 19th century, that of the lone, enlightened, and oppressed genius. You will no doubt be familiar with this story, as it was and still is applied in all directions, to scientists, to artists, to musicians, regardless of historical evidence to the contrary. For example, just to pick one example, the notion that a misunderstood and rejected Mozart was buried with a pauper's funeral in a mass grave, when in fact he had a typical middle-class funeral of the day. And that now celebrated artists were iconoclastic visionaries who struggled in poverty, rather than the reality of there being hired artisans who sought for and received patronage for their work. The same trope is visible in the story that Columbus's supposedly uniquely insightful view of a spherical Earth was overruled by a coven of theologians. This myth was confected by the fiction writer Washington Irving of Headless Horseman fame and Rip Van Winkle, and repeated by both Draper and White as historical fact. And in fact, that is where all of you who raised your hands before that had been told about the flat Earth, it actually comes from a story that Washington Irving wrote in the 1820s. It's astonishing that it has received and still receives such credence. And in fact, I've had examples where I'll show historical evidence to the contrary, and people say, but no, maybe that's just one or two people thought it was spherical. Everybody else thought it was flat, but they didn't leave writings to let us know about that. No, sorry. If in fact you can look at, I'd like to bring to my class, there are Roman coins that show Italy as mistress of the world, and they show a figure of Italy sitting on a globe. So even a Roman of the first century would have had these in his pocket. Now, Columbus was in fact refuted by learned men of his day, and some of them were in fact theologians, but on grounds that Columbus's project to reach China by sailing westward was based on a wildly inaccurate size of the Earth. The diameter of the Earth had been pretty well measured in late antiquity, and voyages by Franciscan friars to the Mongol Empire in eastern China in the 13th century had roughly verified the distance between Europe and the east coast of Asia going eastward. Putting those two pieces of data together, the professors and theologians of Columbus's day rightly knew that going westward from Spain to China was by far the longer way round, and it would be impossible for a ship to carry enough food to make the journey. In fact, Columbus's estimates of the size of the Earth were too small by the width of the Pacific Ocean plus North America. So in fact, when he landed in the Caribbean, it is exactly right where he thought Japan would be. And we don't even know, in fact, whether he died believing he had reached Japan or not. Well, we secretly love stories of oppressed genius pitted against all odds, no doubt in large part because we all like to think of ourselves as misunderstood and ignored geniuses. Well, this last self-reflection is more than a humorous aside, for it points to a second key piece of context, the 19th century rise of the professional scientist and concern over his social status. In the 19th century, the very word scientist had only recently been coined. We know exactly where, when, and by whom it was coined, actually as a joke initially, trading off of art, artist, science, scientist, and everyone sort of laughed, but the name eventually stuck. Curiously, it's an interesting fact that the journal Nature refused to print the word scientist until 1924 because it considered it was a vulgar American neologism, forgetting it had actually come up at a meeting of the British Society for the Advancement of Science in 1838. There were few persons who could be called professional scientists in the sense that they were paid and employed primarily for what we see as scientific endeavors. Colleges and universities focused on the liberal arts, and a clear academic pathway for becoming a scientist and being recognized as such was only beginning to develop. In fact, my own institution, Johns Hopkins University, which was founded in 1876, played a key role in this development by establishing the first formal PhD programs in the sciences in America. Most investigators of nature in the 19th century were thus amateurs, interested persons with the leisure, funds, and abilities to devote themselves to such pursuits. Consequently, the social position of the scientists was far from clear or secure. Who was he? What did he do? Where did he fit into society and its hierarchies? What established or guaranteed his reliability and authority? The identity, position, and authority of political and ecclesiastical figures had been well established and understood for centuries, but those of the newly emerging scientist had not been. Consequently, 19th century scientists needed to craft an identity for themselves, to carve out a stable, and of course preferably high, social position, and to invest themselves with an authoritative voice. Draper and White and many, although far from all, of their contemporaries did this not by creating new authority de novo, but by appropriating it, by taking it away from the already established authority of religion. This strategic move, clever move one might say, was facilitated and presumably normalized by the widespread secularization of governmental authority that was going on at exactly the same time. Perhaps the clearest example of this is the reunification or the unification of Italy. Garibaldi comes in, seizes all of the Pope's temporal lands, and removes all papal secular power, puts it under a secular government. And that's, of course, not the only example of what's going on in Europe at this time. As we know from our own day, scientists evidently did succeed in establishing their identity in public authority such that they are now essentially licensed by degrees and publications and are consulted and respected as experts on a variety of issues. Naturally, such a redistribution of social authority provoked conflicts, and in this way, the false histories of such writers as Draper and White, even though they're bad history, became blueprints for the future. And indeed, I think it is right to say that the struggle for authority is really what undergirds the so-called science-religion controversy in our own day. Let's then return to the present and examine scientism's place and role. One observation worth discussing is the clear proliferation of scientific claims of increasing volume during the past, might say, 30 or so years. Its partisans might well point to this fact as evidence of positivistic progress, of the Comtean kind, More and more people are seeing the light and advancing to their point of view. On the other hand, I think it's very hard to overlook the fact that this growth in strong scientism has occurred simultaneously with the growth of aggressive fundamentalisms within all three of the Abrahamic religions and beyond. And once this observation has been made, the striking similarities between the claims and pretensions and methods of the respective advocates of these groups starts not only to become clear, but also to suggest some interesting linkages and perhaps common origins. Well, Christian fundamentalism is a product of early 20th century America. Its origins lie in a set of social, demographic, and political shifts that include the rise of urbanism, the shift from an agrarian to an industrial base, a huge influx of immigrants, particularly Jews and Catholics, and the development of mainline Protestant theologies that by 1900 had largely accepted biblical criticism and new scientific ideas such as evolution. Fundamentalism arose as an oppositional, a reactionary movement by those, particularly in rural, southern, and Midwestern communities, who felt, probably rightly enough, left behind, excluded, and I think even ambushed by these changes. They were suddenly confronted, with the help of improved communication in the early 20th century, with the fact that America was not the place they thought it was. In other words, it didn't look like their hometown, their isolated hometowns, and that they were not the majority socially, politically, and theologically that they had been led to believe. Hence, their position in society was not only not what they imagined, but in jeopardy. The result was a kind of anger, a hardening of positions, a banding together into more organized groups, and a crusading mentality. Well, the fundamentalist movement, after its heyday in the teens in the 1920s, largely faded away in the 1930s and 40s. I think that's probably because Americans were busy with other things in the 1930s and 40s, to say the least. But it reemerged in the 1960s, and has been with us ever since, in response, in particular, to an organized program to update the woefully outdated American secondary school curricula nationwide. As before, rural communities saw the introduction of new textbooks into their public schools, particularly the biological ones organized around the explanatory power of the theory of evolution, as an invasion, and undoubtedly a reminder of their own displacement from the center of American society. Thus, religious fundamentalism has always been fueled by social and political insecurity, and I think we can say very much the same thing about the emergence of fundamentalisms in Islam and in Judaism. Well, now, interestingly, the scientific establishment and its social and political status has itself been shaken in strikingly similar ways during the past generation. The rise, first of all, of postmodernist critiques of science and its claims, which led to the science wars of the 1980s and 1990s, assailed the supposedly uniquely authoritative and objective character of science and its societal role. Public disillusionment over the failure of science's earlier promises to solve humanity's problems and bring peace and prosperity to all, criticism over pollution from atomic and chemical waste, and that final standby of American culture, anti-intellectualism, all served to weaken the position that science, and by extension scientists, had achieved since the late 19th century. And at the very same time, religious fundamentalism added its own voice in regard to evolution, directly attacking scientific authority not only in the court of public opinion, but in the legal system as well. Thus, in the late 20th century, science found itself, I think to the surprise of its practitioners, under threat. And since scientists now rely on massive government funding, these issues have much more than merely academic importance, for scientists find not only their authority challenged, but the public patronage that's crucial for their work jeopardized. In short, they find themselves unexpectedly in a highly unstable social and political position, one strikingly similar to that of the fundamentalists. And one of their responses has been largely the same: a hardening of position and a crusading mentality, one that uses the battle cry of scientism. In a sense, not only are we good, we're better than you are. Significantly, I observe that the loudest expressions of strong scientism occur precisely in the context of scientific opposition, usually aimed at the popular level, to fundamentalist attacks on the teaching of evolution and the closely related issues of the age of the Earth and the universe. So if you do a quick Google search, good heavens, surely that's not an academic way of doing things, but you look for where the strongest claims of scientism come out, they're almost always, I did this before I came out here for a few days, almost always in the context of this debate over evolution, anti-evolution. As it seems to be the locus. Thus, the science-religion controversy of our day reveals itself as nothing so noble or interesting as the interaction of rival philosophical systems, but rather as a struggle between two crusading fundamentalisms powered largely by concerns about social status and public authority. Who will teach the next generation? What will they teach? And what will be the fate of whichever side emerges the loser? I think there's one document online by a very prominent spokesman for creationism, which more clearly, perhaps dangerously clearly, lays out the question at hand when he says, well, really, this is a question about who's going to sit at the head of the table, them or us. Which is a very sort of frightening kind of way to couch a disagreement. It's certainly not the way to couch a philosophical one. Well, who is the loser? Unfortunately, the biggest loser is the public good. The current situation besmirches and weakens two powerful and crucial forces that should contribute jointly to the public good. I am particularly struck by the arrogance of both groups, both of whom presume to represent realms of thought that should be instilling humility and a recognition of human limitations before the incomprehensible grandeur of the universe and the unfathomable mystery of existence. Instead, both groups compete to give trivial, simplistic, dismissive answers to complex and perhaps unanswerable questions, and in so doing not only preempt more considered and sophisticated thoughts and meditations, but worse, alienate and wound a more flexible and open-minded public. Now, if the public were merely alienated from fundamentalisms of all sorts, there'd be little to complain about. In fact, I'd say that'd be something to celebrate. But the fact is that both sides presume to speak for much larger groups that they do not legitimately represent. Christian fundamentalists do not speak for all Christians, or for the entire mass of nearly 2,000 years of sophisticated Christian theology and philosophy that was worked out by some of the most acute thinkers who ever lived. Scientific fundamentalists do not speak for the entire enterprise of scientific inquiry or for the whole population of scientists, most of whom, in my experience with my colleagues in chemistry and the other sciences, would prefer to be simply left alone to do their important work without being caught up in political and philosophical issues that most see as outside their interests and recognize as possibly beyond their realm of competence. The busy general public, which is not assisted at all, I think, by the oversimplifications of the popular media, cannot distinguish easily and readily between these minorities and the larger communities that they appear to represent. The result is then either a taking of sides based on faulty and selective information, or a partial or total rejection, or at least an ill-considered prejudice against the larger realms of both science and religion, or one or the other. And that situation is clearly to the detriment of the public good. Well, I'm going to be so bold as to suggest that there might be a solution, and it might be a fairly simple solution. One of the things that characterizes fundamentalism, whether religious or scientific, is the demand for certainty, and the conviction that its proponents possess that certainty. What's the antidote? A pinch of doubt. A pinch of doubt. Not so much doubt that we lapse into the deserts of nihilism or hopeless skepticism, but just enough to give the room for growth. Doubt provides the space in which inquiry is born, and the room in which to grow in knowledge and belief. Unfortunately, I think a lot of religious people, and not just fundamentalists, are too often encouraged to view doubt as a kind of weakness. But it is doubt that gives the strength to faith. Without doubt, there is in fact no faith. Only when there is doubt can there be faith, and it is only by faith that either religion or in fact science can actually operate. Without doubt, science and theology, the twin offspring of human yearning for answers, would come to a standstill. St. Augustine began his own journey of intellect and faith by first trying to demonstrate to himself that he himself existed. And how did he do it? He said, well, I think I know that I exist because I can doubt that I exist. Some centuries before Descartes' own deconstructive method of grounding himself anew. Thomas Aquinas, after a lengthy analysis of the way God might act within the natural world and how we might distinguish a true miracle from an unusual or surprising natural event, concluded that in fact there was no way for human beings to tell because human beings are unable to see with perfect knowledge the chain of causation that results in a given effect. Thus he concludes that no matter how great our knowledge, deciding whether or not an event is miraculous or natural ultimately requires an act of faith. And importantly, an act of faith in either direction. In other words, we can't even come to a decision without an act of faith. It takes an act of faith to say this is a natural event as much as it says to say this is a miraculous one. And here we clearly return to the realm of the scientific. It was the same issue of causation that was a subject of a very interesting discussion that took place in 1624 between Galileo and his friend Maffeo Barberini, recently elected as Pope Urban VIII. Galileo was absolutely certain, he had no doubt, that the tides were caused by the Earth's motion, and thus provided proof of that motion. Urban replied that this was possible, but that the world might be so contrived that a given phenomenon might have more than one cause, and some of those causes might well be beyond human ability to sense or to discover. And it was, by the way, Galileo's published mockery of this opinion of Urban VIII that initiated the problems against him in 1632. It's a very foolish thing to have published it that way. But that maybe was because he had no doubts about his own position. The limits of human knowledge that should ensure the existence of doubt pertain equally to both science and theology. Can we determine the true and complete causes of phenomena, or only the apparent ones? Are observed causes true causes, or only correlations? Do our senses give us reliably true knowledge of the external world? Is the universe reliably regular and uniform? None of these questions that stand at the heart of scientific investigation can be answered with certainty, but each requires an act of affirmative faith that allows the scientific enterprise to function. Now I want to be very, very clear. This observation is by no means intended to undermine the scientific enterprise or question its validity or value, but only to highlight the essential role that is played by faith, not by certainty. The foundations that scientific work takes for granted and must take for granted are in fact insoluble issues that trouble philosophers greatly. What science sees as fundamental givens are often necessary statements of faith, and these don't go away or become any less faith statements when scientistic oversimplifiers wave off the concerns of philosophers as uninteresting or imaginary. Well, this is the wonderfully sloppy, always seat of our pants thing that we call science. Neither it nor its practitioners gain any more authority by making bold assertions of its unique access to truth. The recognition of doubt and faith doesn't weaken science one jot, but it liberates it from the straitjacket of an imperialistic or hegemonic position that it cannot legitimately and rigorously maintain. And the same is to be said of religion, where faith ought not to be confused, I think, with certainty. Well, you see where I've gotten to. I've fallen into philosophizing in the end anyway. So that I would take as a good signal for me to come to a close. In conclusion, I would recall that Aristotle claimed that scientific inquiry, in which he included the physical, the mathematical, and the theological, began when human beings had enough leisure time to look out at the world and wonder about it. And wonder is itself a kind of doubt. A doubt that challenges our senses, our minds, our preconceived notions, and spurs us on towards that thing that both good science and good religion have always loved and fostered, namely, education in the pursuit of knowledge and understanding. A better understanding of history will serve to smash the origin myth at the core of scientism, strip away its rhetorical and fictional bases, and reveal the surprisingly cooperative dynamic that is very often, but not always, characterized the pursuit of both science and religion. A better understanding of philosophy will reveal the astonishing gaffes and non sequiturs made routinely by the modern-day prophets of scientism. I haven't spoken about that at all because I assume that my philosophical predecessors in this series already covered that quite thoroughly. A better understanding of the richness of theology and biblical interpretation will undercut both the simplistic claims of religious fundamentalism and the scientistic replies made to it. And equally important is a better understanding of motivations, including self-motivations, motivations that I have described as born predominantly of social and political insecurity, and as such not essentially related to the proper goal, I think, of both science and religion, namely the difficult, the thorny journey towards an ever better understanding of ourselves, the universe, and of existence itself. Thank you. I would be happy to take questions.
Hi, thank you so much for your lecture. My name is Spencer Fuller, and I'm an Italian major hoping to go to medical school. I have a couple questions. So first, as a disclaimer / explanation, I'd like to say that I am an aspiring physician, so scientist, and I'm also a deeply religious individual, so I don't associate with either form of fundamentalism. But I do have a question about it. It seems from my perspective that scientific fundamentalism is winning so to speak, and has the complete hand in the complete upper hand in the public sphere. Is that how things really are? And if so, how did it get that way? And then my follow-up question would be that your solution is simple, and I agree that both sides need humility. But how do you see things playing out practically in the coming years?
Okay, well, to touch on your first, is scientific fundamentalism winning? I don't know. I slightly doubt it, honestly, because, in the 1960s and 70s, there were social scientists who said that, well, religion has about 30 more years to go and that's it. And somehow that hasn't happened, has it? Religion turns out to be an extraordinarily resilient thing. The thing about scientific fundamentalism at the moment is that they have a couple of people who have been invested, one by government authority as the spokesman for science in Britain, not to name names, and have been very successful and articulate in, well, putting over a sort of a bill of goods, I'm afraid, in writing very popular books that I'm afraid are, in fact, have been on the bestseller list for a very long period of time. Of course, I'm talking about some of Dawkins' work. He can be a very influential speaker. What he is doing, however, is, well, philosophically, I think, dealing with Richard Dawkins on a level of philosophy is like shooting fish in a barrel. So I'm just not quite so unkind as to have to do that. But he is obviously speaking some sort of words that people are eager to hear for some sort of a reason. And I think we need to get at the roots of what that is. Why are people listening to him? It's not because he has so much authority or that he has ironclad arguments, because he doesn't. But what's the cause of that? And I'm not sure I know. I think one of the things, and I hope this doesn't come across as too cynical, but I think a lot of his followers, with whom I engage perhaps more frequently than I would like, they strike me as people who are still angry that their parents made them get out of bed on Sunday morning to go to church, very honestly. And it's a kind of adolescent reactionism, either to their parents or to other people. I'm sorry, I don't mean to oversimplify it or to make light of it, but I'm sorry, I can't shake that impression, honestly, when I talk to some of them. Your second question was...
Practically, how do you see things playing
out? How do I see things playing out practically in the future? I find that, I think, from a historical perspective, public attitudes tend to be rather fickle, and the public gets tired of things after a while. And they'll probably get tired, I think, at some point of the gospel of scientism. I think what we have to do in the meantime is for historians, philosophers, scientists, religious believers, all of us who see the weakness of the scientific agenda, to keep talking about it. And we don't actually have to do it in dramatic ways to get on international television or something like that. We do it by talking to people that we know in our own surroundings. And I think that kind of slow evolution of movement can bear a lot of fruit. In fact, my understanding from teaching science and religion courses at Johns Hopkins University, probably one of the most aggressively secular institutions in the United States. And no, I'm not going to tell that story since it's being recorded. Never mind. Ask me later. My students have never had presented to them rational and intellectually rich versions of religion. It has never come to their attention that such a thing exists. And so, naturally, they acquiesce in the sort of pseudo-sophisticated philosophies of scientism. But when they find out about it, it's like, wow, that's really neat. Why haven't I heard about this before? Well, I think we're all doing them a disservice by, now I've pointed my fingers at the failures of the scientific community. I point my fingers at the failure of the religious community, all religious communities, to do the job of accurate intellectual education of their members. I know there's a priest at Hopkins, the Newman House, who likes to say, you shouldn't leave college with a 6th grade understanding of your faith. Right? And, that sort of sums it up right there. We all have to do a better job. Oh dear, I've beaten you into silence. That's really bad. I'm sorry.
I have a question. So I guess, where do you draw the line of taking what science knows and what you understand to crossing over into scientism, I guess?
Right. Look, science has a game plan. It has a set of rules that you have to abide by if you're going to do science. Okay? And these are the kinds of things that, for example, disable the current forms of creation science or intelligent design from being legitimately considered scientific. By the same token, these rules of science also disable scientism from being a substitute for science, because science has to recognize that it plays by a certain set of rules, and that those things are rules, not fundamental principles of the universe. Okay? The simple example is, of course, the difference between methodological naturalism and philosophical naturalism. If you're going to, you're all familiar with this, of course, so I'll just say very quickly, if you're going to do science, you have to appeal to natural causation. Otherwise, that's not science. That's the way science as we know it today is set up, period. Okay? You don't want to play by those rules, then you play a different game. Okay? But that commitment to play by those rules doesn't mean that only natural causation exists. You can't just go from a methodological agreed upon rule of the game to making it into a philosophical position. Okay? What I like to do is, which really upsets some people, is to point out, so who were the people that actually came up with methodological naturalism? Did 19th century scientists sort of come up with this all on their own? And some people say, well, probably. Well, no, actually, it was the theologians very early on in the Christian era who thought that when they were trying to answer questions, appeal to God's intervention was a cop-out. It was not a rule of the game. They couldn't rule out that it would happen, but that wasn't so good. So you find these fantastic systems being put together by theological natural philosophers in the 11th and 12th century, where they basically reduce God's action in the world to an initial moment of creation. And all that he does is he creates elements with particular natures, that is, properties. And then the properties just take over. And interestingly enough, they can get biblical justification for this, because if you look at the first chapter of Genesis, what does it say? It says, when creatures are being formed on the earth, let the earth bring forth. It doesn't say, I'm creating. Let the earth bring forth. And the medieval theologians read this to say that God put into the elements, into the earth and into the sea, the ability to create life forms. So this blows the mind of fundamentalists on both sides of the issue. Okay? But it's something we should know. It's something we should teach, very simply. Oh, there's one question back there. Yes. Oh, absolutely. I just had this conversation with a group of students. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Repeat the question.
Oh, the question was, do I see it as a problem that nowadays we are lacking in leisure time? And absolutely. And just to repeat what I said in part to the students was, look at the world around us. We have all these fantastic technological devices. Airplanes take us around the globe. quickly. We pick up the telephone and talk to people. We have machines that wash our clothes and our dishes. We don't have to grow our own food. We can just go to the store because somebody's put it there, and we have stuff called money that we can't eat, but we can trade for food. So we have all this leisure time. Think about what your great-grandparents had to do. Talk about not having leisure time, right? Yet somehow our lives have less leisure time than that of our grandparents. How did that happen? It's because we fill our lives with all kinds of junk. The junk that advertisers tell us we need to be legitimate people. Okay? I think we should oppose that. I think we can all see it also in all of our own lives. I see it certainly, and I rebel against it at my own university when Dean X and Deanling Y tell me to fill out some paperwork or something. And so I spend all my day pushing papers and filling out stupid forms that nobody's going to read anyway, rather than doing what I thought I was hired to do, which was, well, think great thoughts. Right? Read a book. Teach my students. We have, particularly in this country, a loud world where we're subjected to stimuli constantly of all sorts. And I think it gets harder and harder for us to realize that knowledge and understanding comes in silence, not in noise. I wish we had more silence. That would be my prayer for us all, to have a little bit more silence in our lives. And leisure. Aristotle, I think, was right.
What is the present-day scientists, what is like a survey of their religiosity and the trend of their more or less religious, and what does that say?
This is extremely interesting. This is an extremely interesting point. The question is, what are modern-day trends in terms of the religiosity of practicing scientists? In 1925, when the Scopes trial, the so-called monkey trial, was being carried out, or was in the newspaper, a survey was done of the religious level of religious belief of scientists working in different disciplines who were all professors at universities. In, I think it was the late 1990s, someone got the bright idea to trot out that 1925, now 75-year-old survey and give it again to the same demographic, science professors at universities. In fact, what do you think the result was? There was statistically no change. None. So what we often perceive as a kind of rampant secularization is in part a confection of perhaps fears on the one side, hopes on the other. Now, how that has changed in the last 15 years or so, I can't say. But I think it is quite significant that there was statistically, in fact, no difference over a 75-year period.
I was wondering, are there any other offspring from these two groups that are unintended consequences? I'm thinking of perhaps apathy.
Yeah,
Or
absolutely.
authority.
You know, sure. This apathy is one of the things that's going to happen. It's like, I don't want to get involved with this. It doesn't matter to me. You know, what you're worried about more, or what's more of a concern to both religious people and scientific people, is not the fiery refutation of your position, because then at least somebody cares enough to argue with you. It's apathy, where they say, it doesn't matter to me. Science doesn't matter to me. Religion doesn't matter to me. That's the more corrosive issue by far than head-on controversy. And I think the kind of arguments getting nowhere and just people lobbing missiles at one another over the heads of the great majority in the middle is leading to that kind of disillusionment and apathy. And, you know, it says, well, you know, these two sources of authority can't agree. Where am I going to go for authority? The heck with it.
Sorry, follow up with that is, as a historian, do you see any precedents for what takes place when apathy is victor?
Yeah, I do actually. In the late 17th century, there was what I would call an atheist panic in England. That all of a sudden there were all these atheists out there. No one has ever actually been able to pin one down and say, this one was the atheist. But one of the things it came out of, certainly, was a sense of apathy, a sense of exhaustion after the English Civil War, which was a political but with religious overtones, conflict between a conservative puritanical group and more High Church of England group. And it swung back and forth. The sects multiplied and splintered like nobody's business in these times. And it just seemed that by the time of the Restoration in 1660, people were sick of the controversy. So I think it sort of goes in with what I was saying before about the public having a limited attention span. At some point, they just get tired.
So it's a vacuum then.
In a sense, yeah. So we have to be careful about not exhausting the public, but giving them stuff of which there's no shortage that's really interesting, that'll make them think in other ways. Okay. Thank you very much.